Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this webinar in our Demographic Dividend Luminaries Series. Happy World Population Day to you all. My name is Molly Maisner. I am on the Demographic Dividend team here at the Bill and Melinda Gates Institute for Population and Reproductive Health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Today's webinar, we will be speaking with Dr. Ronald D of the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Lee is a pioneer in the work he's conducted with national transfer accounts, which we'll learn more about today. We also have the great privilege of speaking with Dr. Latif Dramani, who is a leader of DD research and national transfer accounts. Before we begin, I'd like to draw your attention to the interpretation function of Zoom. We are delighted to offer French interpretation for this webinar today, and you can access that at the bottom of your Zoom window by clicking on the globe icon and selecting French if that is your preference. Thank you to our wonderful interpreter today. Next, as I said, we are very privileged to have Dr. Ron Lee as our featured guest of this third event in the Demographic Dividend Luminary Series in celebration of World Population Day. Dr. Lee is a professor emeritus of economics and demography at the University of California, Berkeley. He is also the associate director at the Center for Economics and Demography of Aging. This webinar will also feature Dr. Ian Salas, who is an assistant scientist at the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health in the Department of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health. Lastly, we have the enormous honor of having Dr. Latif Dramani joining us today. Professor Dramani is a true pioneer of DD research in the African continent and has led incredible work in national transfer accounts in Senegal. He is professor of economics at the University of Thiès and coordinator of the Center for Research in Economics and Applied Finance. He is the coordinator of the Regional Center of Excellence for Research in Generational Economics, and he is also representative of the NTA International Executive Council for Francophone Africa. Thank you again to all of our speakers for joining us today. As we enter this presentation and following dialogue, we invite you to please share any questions you have using the Q&A function in Zoom, located at the bottom of your Zoom window. We look forward to having an engaging discussion with you. But first, we'd like to present you with our interview with Dr. Ron Lee.
We're delighted to welcome with us Dr. Ronald Lee, professor of economics and demography at the University of California at Berkeley. He is one of the key thinkers in the field of economic demography. Dr. Ron, welcome.
Thank you, Ian. It's a pleasure to be here.
Dr. Ron Lee, can you share more about how you started working on the intersection between economics and demography?
Well, after I finished college, the first thing I did was to join the Peace Corps, and I spent 2 years in Ethiopia teaching in a small rural secondary school. And Ethiopia was a very poor country, and it had high fertility and high mortality. There were a lot of infant deaths in the village I saw, and so on. I wasn't really, thinking a lot about population and economic development at that point, but I certainly absorbed what a very different culture and economy could be like, and I also developed a lot of reluctance to sort of intervene in other people's lives, which were so different from my own and about which I knew so little. But when I left Ethiopia, then I joined a very interdisciplinary demographic training program at Berkeley, where I studied demography for 2 years, but also biology, economics, statistics, and so on. So I studied economics. I did a very fast Ph.D. in 2.5 years, but while I was doing it, I found I had to write term papers, research papers, and so on, and it just was very natural to use the demographic background I'd acquired and try to integrate it with what I was learning economics. And so that's what I did during my studies and also as a graduate writing my dissertation. which was very much an integration of economics and demography. Initially, I was working more on historical demography, and my interest in economic development and in the economics of population aging and so on developed gradually, probably as much through the courses I was teaching in economic demography and macroeconomics as through anything else. And then I also got drawn in through projects of the National Academy of Sciences, like the 1986 project report on population and economic development. And I've just sort of learned on the job since then. Yeah, so it's mostly what I do now, I must say, and I'm particularly interested in formal demography and formal economics and trying to integrate those models and those ways of looking at the world.
Right. So, Dr. Ron, you mentioned NTA, and NTA is the National Transfer Accounts. And I know that you and Dr. Andrew Mason have been credited for developing NTA. Can you tell us more about the concepts behind NTA?
Yes, well, it's a combination of the economic life cycle and the demographic life cycle, social life cycle. We start life as children. We're totally dependent on our parents, and that lasts. Back in hunter-gatherer societies, that period of dependency would last up to about age 18 or 20. Very long, not so different than today. In agricultural societies, it's shorter because there is opportunity for safe work for children in agriculture where they can be somewhat productive. But then again, in industrial societies, it becomes very long. So there's this long period of dependency in childhood, and then in old age, again, at least after hunter-gatherer societies where the elderly remain productive throughout their lives, in agricultural and industrial societies, there's an end of later life stage of some sort of retirement. And again, dependency on the working age population. In between childhood and old age, we have this, I don't know what to call it, let's say working ages in which people are parents and they're generally producing a surplus. They're producing through their labor more than they consume. And then in various ways, the surplus they produce is redistributed to the children and the elderly. And NTA measures the labor income, what is produced by the labor of people at each age, whether it's self-employed or employed in a formal sector job or whatever. We count all this and we average it across the population, and we have a labor income age profile, we call it. And then we have a similar one for consumption. These are defined quite broadly. I won't go into the details now, but it includes the public sector contributions to consumption. So these describe, just looking at the graph of these, you can see these three periods of dependency for two of them and surplus in the middle. Mm-hmm. Now, NTA measures those things, but then it also is interested in this process of redistribution and how it happens. Well, of course, it happens partly through the family, and in traditional societies, it's mainly through the family as parents support their children and parents or working age adults support their elderly parents themselves, the grandparents. But as economic development proceeds, also the public sector grows, and the public sector gets involved in public education and provision of healthcare. At later stages, it will get involved in public pensions and so on. So some of this redistribution is taking place through the family. Some of it is taking place through the public sector. And then some of it is sort of done by oneself by saving during those productive years. and investing and then drawing on that perhaps in old age. So we have the family, the market, the state sort of channeling this redistribution, and the nature of that redistribution institutionally changes over the course of economic development, but something on the order of half of total output is redistributed in this way. It's really a big deal. It's not a sort of marginal thing. That's what NTA does. Now, why is that useful? Well, as the population age distribution changes, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, then the number of people in each of these life cycle stages, the number of people in childhood versus in working ages versus in older ages, changes. The share of the population in each of those categories changes, and that changes the number of donors and the number of recipients in each of these categories, and that leads to all kinds of stresses and imbalances, and it requires adjustments in in economic behavior, in public institutions, and so on. We're in the middle, in the rich industrial countries, of a very difficult and painful and much resisted readjustment period as we look at things like public pension problems and the expense of publicly provided health care and what happens with population aging, driving up the costs of these programs, which are in many cases fiscally unsustainable. And then those rising costs of aging for the public sector begin to squeeze out other possible projects. We're in a transitional stage in which things have to change, institutions, values, behavior, and that's always painful. But once we've made those adjustments, there's nothing terribly difficult about dealing with population aging, so far as I can see.
What are some of the findings or insights that you've been able to draw on based on that data that wasn't possible before, but now is possible with NTA?
One of the first things goes back to an observation you made a few moments ago, that there are all these institutional and cultural differences across the countries. And so we see in East Asia a strong pattern of familial support for the elderly, also familial support for children, continuing longer and in a more pronounced way than in other areas. So you see a lot of private spending on child education, sort of supplementing the public spending. But then you also see not a dominant source of support for the elderly, but a substantial source of support for the elderly coming from the family. We thought we'd see that all over the developing world, but really it's been pretty much limited to East Asia. And much more commonly in the developing world and in the developed world, we see the elderly continuing on, this is on average, on net, to be supporting their adult children and grandchildren rather than the reverse. So that's East Asia, a very different pattern. In Latin America, it was a surprise to see how similar to Europe the public transfer system was, for the elderly anyway. The pension systems look very European. I think the Brazilian system is probably more generous than the European systems. And they, of course, have to face the same problems that the European systems do as the population ages. On the other hand, unlike the European countries, the Latin American ones are much less generous in terms of child investment and child support. That's changing some now. And one of the things that's nice to see is changes over time when we do repeated NTAs in the same country. In Europe, you see this very strong welfare state that invests heavily in the elderly and in the young. And for the elderly, it's in many countries, you see the elderly relying entirely, virtually 100% on public transfers to support their consumption. This despite the fact that they hold assets. They do have asset income and assets, but they don't need to use it because they're generously supported through the public sector. Presumably, this is going to have implications as these generations reach the end of life, and presumably their children will then be inheriting more assets than would have been the case before. That may be true in parts of Latin America too, that one of the consequences of the generous public pension systems may be asset preservation by the elderly, and then perhaps increased inheritances by their kids. In any event, we see these very interesting regional patterns. It's not just one country, but you see many countries sharing these things. And for Latin America, it just amazes me. We look at the NTA labor earning profiles, and if you plot them on top of each other after standardizing for the level, so that you just compare the shapes, they look almost indistinguishable sometimes. You really see the power of regional, whatever it is, I guess culture, maybe some regional economic forces, but that's very striking.
Can you talk a bit more about how you think NTA can inform discussions about the demographic dividend? And I also know that together with Dr. Andy Mason, you introduced the concept of the second demographic dividend, right? And differentiating it from the first. Can you also tell us more about what it is that you're calling the second demographic dividend? And how did you come up with that idea?
Okay, but why don't I start with the demographic transition in the first
exactly.
demographic dividend.
Yes.
The demographic transition is virtually universal across all countries in the world. Countries are at different stages, but the demographic transition is this process of moving from high fertility and high mortality to low fertility and low mortality, and lots of things happen in between. And typically, first mortality, the process takes maybe 150 years or 2 centuries for a country to completely transition through. As I think about it, because I think it begins when mortality begins to decline. So in Europe, for example, let's say that was around 1800. The fertility decline in Europe doesn't happen until 1880, 1890. So you have 8 or 9 centuries of mortality decline and gradually accelerating population growth rate because you have lower mortality and fertility remains about the same. And then you have maybe a few decades of fertility decline towards replacement level. And during that period, during that middle period, where you have more rapid initially more rapid population growth, and then you begin to get fertility decline. When you begin to get fertility decline, then the share of children in the population begins to decline as well. I should say first it rises while mortality is declining and fertility stays high. Right. Then it declines, and during this period in which the share of children in the population is declining, the share of working age people is rising. And that gives a kind of mechanical boost to the growth rate of per capita income. Eventually, this stage comes to an end, fertility stops declining and levels off, and then the population begins to age. And aging then raises the dependency ratio again. And at the end of this process, you end up with pretty much the same total dependency ratio that you started with. Now, no country has yet finished this process. I said the European countries started around 1800. Well, they're not done by 2000. We're still in the middle of the aging process, which is the tail end of the demographic transition. Maybe that'll end around mid-century for some European countries. hard to say. Countries like Japan, the oldest country in the world, it's still got another, 50% of its aging to do. And countries like China and Korea are just booming along behind Japan in terms of aging, and they're going to be aging very rapidly. By mid-century, they're going to be very old, but that process will continue throughout the rest of the century, more slowly, perhaps. So it's a long process. In the middle of that process, we have this demographic dividend phase, where the share of the population and labor force rises and then declines. Before the transition, there are a lot of kids and few elderly. After the transition, there are few kids and a lot of elderly, but the overall total dependency looks very similar. Now, what do we mean when we say dependency, or talk about working ages, or talk about childhood and old age and so on? Well, that's where we turn to NTA. As demographers, we say something like, oh, childhood is 0 to 18, and working ages are 18 to 60 or 18 to 65 or whatever. We make some fairly arbitrary decisions, boundaries. With NTA, well, we can see at what age a generation begins producing as much as it consumes. We look at what children consume, and we look at what the elderly consume. We measure these in NTA, and so we can actually, and then we also see what each age produces through labor income. And for the elderly, you can also see what they get through asset income. And so we can estimate how much assistance they need from those in working ages, and we can weight them accordingly and so on. And so definitions of things like childhood and old age become less arbitrary. In any event, you can see all this in the NTA, and you can see whether the reduction in the share of children offsets the increase in the share of elderly, whatever that trade-off is, and so on. At this point, the work that Gretchen Dunauer talked about in the previous webinar is very important, because children, of course, take an enormous amount of their parents' time. And that parents' time is one of the costs of children, and that cost goes down when the number of children goes down. Now, what about the elderly? Well, we think of the elderly maybe sick and infirm and needing a lot of care time, but really the elderly mostly are caring for one another. An elderly man will be cared for by his elderly wife. An elderly wife may be cared for by the elderly husband, who may not be as competent as she, but all the same. So at least that's what it looks like from the work of the countries that Gretchen Dunauer are included in her project. Anyway, we can see all this, and NTA tells us this, and then we can see what the consequences of the changing population age distribution are. I wanted to add, actually, going back to the demographic transition for a moment, that perhaps the most profound change with the demographic transition is in the economic and social roles and activities of women. I calculated in a paper that in a pre-transition population, a woman might spend 70% of her adult time raising young children, which is a very time-consuming task. And in a modern society, well, post-transitional, let's say, with 2 children and a long life expectancy, that 70% drops to 14%. It's cut by 80%. And that transforms the economies, I think, in a permanent and irreversible way, even though that also is one of these, for some people, painful transitional stages that it may clash with cultural values and so on. But I really think it's just a matter of time. So the first demographic dividend is that rather mechanical increase in the share of the population that's in the labor force, followed by a decrease. The gains of the first dividend are pretty much undone by population aging, and populations end up where they started eventually. So the question is whether it's possible to convert those transitory gains into a more permanent basis for the economy, and whether there are other changes that take place during this transition that are of a more long-lasting sort. And that is where the second demographic transition comes in. And we emphasize two things. One is Andy Mason and I, as we develop these ideas, the first is that, of course, low fertility is at the center of the demographic transition, but there is a strong association, for whatever reason, between the level of fertility and the amount that parents or that society expends per child. Now, we measure this in a way that sort of washes out the effect of per capita income, which of course is also important, but we measure this in terms of years of adult labor that is invested in the human capital of each child. And we find that as the total fertility rate goes from, say, 6 to 1.5 or so, the years of prime age adult labor invested in each child goes from about 1 to 5 or 6. So it's sort of the mirror image of the fertility decline. Mm-hmm. And that has profound effects for the health and productivity and behavior of all those children who now grow up more educated. And then, of course, it will also be influencing the fertility of future generations and the sort of home environment of those future generations and so on. So that's the first part of the second demographic dividend. The other part, which is also very important, is physical capital. So there are two ways to think about this. If we think about, say, a constant savings rate, say 10% of an economy's output is saved and invested each year. In a country that is growing rapidly, much of that investment has to go to provide the new workers with capital, the capital to work with, a factory to work in, farm machinery, or whatever it may be. As fertility declines and as the population growth rate slows, then an increasing share of what is saved can be spent on so-called capital deepening, making more capital equipment available for each worker, because there are not as many new workers that have to be provided for. That's one way of looking for it. That just pops out of neoclassical growth models without any age distribution at all. But if we think of the age distribution, we can look at it in a different way, which is, first, that in almost any society, it is the elderly who hold the lion's share of the assets. If you look at, say, an age schedule of asset ownership or of asset income, it is a very strongly upwardly sloping, roughly straight line showing just increasing holdings as age goes up. Why would that be? Well, it's partly because the elderly save during their lifetimes and accumulate assets that way. It's also because they inherit assets from their parents as their parents pass on. And it's also because there is, at least in recent century or two, there are capital gains. So you invest when you're young, but the value of those investments goes up, and there's a high rate of return to the investments and so on. So it's the elderly who hold most of the assets. And when there's an increased share of elderly relative to working age people, then there's an increased amount of assets or capital per worker, and that makes the workers more productive. So that is the second demographic dividend, as we've emphasized it, with human capital and physical capital accumulation accelerated, boosted by the population aging and the later stages of the demographic transition. So you have those gains that come from investment in physical capital and human capital. Those are, let's say, permanent. They're not transitory like the first demographic dividend. They don't go away. If anything, they feed on themselves and lead to further growth in the future in a kind of upward spiral of development.
So, as you know, also in November, the world population reached the number of 8 billion. I just wanted to hear, what is your reaction? What does that mean to you, and how does it relate to all this interest that you've had with demography and economics combined, and seeing now that we are now at 8 billion?
Well, I started my economic demography career thinking about Malthus and Malthusian economics of pre-industrial Europe and that sort of thing, which has to do really with the size of the population in relation to the environment, in relation to the natural resources of land and so on. Then in the middle, I moved to this economics of changing age distributions. I guess now what you're asking about is going back to the Malthusian kinds of concerns, because so far as the age distribution goes, 8 billion, 2 billion, 1 billion, it's all, what we're looking at really is the relative size of the different age groups, not their absolute size. Mm-hmm. So the 8 billion, we're really, I think, worrying mostly about the pressures on natural resources, particularly renewable resources like water, climate, atmospheric qualities, and temperatures, and so on. Here, first, a lot depends on what happens after 8 billion, and there are different views about whether population growth may cease and reverse well before the end of the century, which I think the projections out of YASA, the Wittgenstein Center, suggest will happen because of increasing education, including in sub-Saharan Africa. And a paper in Lancet made similar projections. The United Nations, on the other hand, has, let's say, a more conservative view in which population growth continues until closer to the end of the century. This continuing growth makes all remedies, all attempts to address these environmental constraints more difficult. I don't think there's any question about that, in my mind at least. On the other hand, I don't think that the population growth is the biggest problem or the one that is most easily addressed. I think more pressing and more effective is attention to, first of all, international cooperation, or even just cooperation by people within a country. If you look at the US, I mean, we can't get people to agree there's even a problem. But I think if we could agree internationally and agree on standards and policies and have compliance internationally and so on, there's a lot that could be done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, again for that informative and thought-provoking interview. At this time, we are going to go into the discussion portion of the event, and we again invite all of our audience members to submit questions as you have them in the Q&A function of the chat, and we will be answering them later on in this webinar. I'd like to introduce Professor Latif Dramani to speak with us and present on generational economy in Africa and some of the results seen in Senegal. At this time, Professor Dramani, the floor is yours.
Ok, bonjour à tout le monde. Merci pour l'invitation.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for the invitation to be here
Avec Ron Lee. Donc,
to this event and discussions with Dr. Lee, Ronald Lee.
NTA, ça fait maintenant
I
plus de
work
15 ans que nous
in
travaillons
the
ensemble.
NTA network and have done so for over 15 years. We have worked together previously.
Les résultats du Sénégal, parce que dans le réseau,
So here I'm just going to present the Senegalese results because
nos pays ont des
in the network,
problèmes différents.
as has been said,
Donc, des problèmes différents. Et
we face
si on
different
prenait ici le cas du
problems.
Sénégal, donc là, je vais vous montrer les derniers résultats.
If we
Ce
look
qui est
at
important pour les
Senegal's
pays d'Afrique,
case,
c'est que nous,
I'm
on a
showing
des
the
résultats
most recent
plus
results.
importants.
What is most important for African countries
Donc, nous utilisons
when it comes
principalement
to
les
the economic
pour
dividend
politique publique. Donc, ici, ça, c'est le profil officiel
is
que
public
notre centre,
policy.
a fait pour le gouvernement du Sénégal, donc qui est dans un rapport officiel du Sénégal. Donc,
So we
le
need
Sénégal
to
utilise aujourd'hui la NTA pour alimenter
have these official
son plan de
reports
développement
from the
sur les questions
Senegalese
de capital humain
government.
et aussi sur
We
la
have
question
a
du capture du dividende démographique.
Center for
Donc,
Development.
la courbe dont Ron vient de parler, c'est elle qui est à gauche, le profil moyen. Et aujourd'hui,
So now we're going to talk about the
vous voyez que
average
le déficit
profile
de
on
la
the
jeunesse
left.
est très, très important.
And on the right-hand side, we
Donc,
have
nous avons
added
plus un problème de
consumption
de
and
jeunesse.
labor
On a un
income
déficit
profiles.
la jeunesse à plus de
So
4 000,
our issue is more with
4 500 milliards de
youth.
francs CFA. Donc, le surplus généré, comme vous le constatez sur le graphique à gauche, en bleu clair, ne permet pas de
So
financer le déficit.
the left-hand
Donc, nous, on a
graph
ce problème, premier dividende
shows that it's not possible to finance the deficits that exist because we're beginning the demographic transition. These are important issues regarding demographic pressure on resources and how we can finance this dependence on youth. So that's a very important point. And it's the issue faced by our leaders. How can we create structural policies to create more employment for youth?
Nous, le Sénégal a eu à faire 3 profils. Avec, nous, on a été,
Senegal
on a été en
has
contact avec,
3 profiles.
Ron, Andy, et puis les gens du réseau
We
depuis les années
contacted
2005. Et puis aujourd'hui,
Ron,
le
Andy,
Sénégal a fait un profil
and
en
some
2005,
other
un profil
people
en
we've been working
2011,
with since
et puis le profil global,
2005.
le profil de 2019.
So we created a
Donc,
profile in
les 3 profils
2005, in
sur
2011, and in
environ
2019,
15-16 ans.
which gives us a way to view the evolution over about 15 years.
Ce qu'on cherche aujourd'hui, on s'est rendu compte que nos gouvernements sont de plus en plus sensibles à la question démo-économique. Donc,
Our governments are ever more sensitive to the economic life cycle, to planning for it.
Tous les dirigeants aujourd'hui sont vraiment
in terms of policy, all leaders are more and more aware of the pressure to manage crisis, because most crises come from the fact that youth are out of work or are out of formal work. Once we manage to capture these resources, many different outcomes are made possible. What we noticed in 2005 in Senegal is that we found the deficit was covered mainly by households rather than by the public sector. So in this part of the world, in Africa, households are the ones that take responsibility for the deficit that exists. So today, this is a pressing problem. Our African leaders, our African Union needs to address this issue. We launched a demographic program in 2017, and through it, we are supporting different countries to do what Senegal did with its population. Senegal produced this document, and further on the presentation, we have the official documents. We created observatories, demographic observatories. So here we have the comparative profiles, and now we are working with all Western and Central African countries that adopted this methodology, not only in terms of research, but also for developing policy. So what you see on the right-hand side is Senegal's DD report. And we're working with different ministries, with the ones that appear on screen, to develop these and to work with national transfer systems. We strategically also work with the Ministry for Budgets in order to think about investment in demography and how to come up with resources. And we are accompanied by the Economic Commission for Africa in this work. So this work for 15 years has resulted in this report. And all of the networks have realized that profiles change from country to country and from historic period to historic period. Every single profile is unique, even if there are usually a series of tendencies worldwide. It's much better to take an individualized approach than to try to generalize, because we need a profile that speaks to each of us, that we can understand. And this is how we're working at the moment. This is how we've worked with some other Western African countries as well. We need to think that the problem of youth doesn't only exist in Senegal. It is happening in most of the region. In Angola, in most of Africa, actually, this is an issue. So I think that all of this has allowed the Economic Commission for Africa, the African Union, to be aware of the issue, as well as many other institutions and partners. Our center isn't going to benefit from this. And different institutions are asking to continue developing this work because it has such positive outcomes. But all of this is part of building networks and working with these networks. It gives us a different perspective of how we look at individuals.
Thank you so much, Professor Dramani, for those valuable insights. We really appreciate them. And at this time, we'd like to open up the webinar for questions. Again, please submit them using the Q&A function of Zoom, and we will pose them to both Dr. Ronald Lee as well as Professor Dramani. I see one in the chat right now. Can you explain more on the strong linkages between aging, health, and economy?
I didn't quite get the question. The question is to explain more the linkages between population age distribution, health, and what?
Between aging, health, and economy.
Between aging, health, and economy. Well, there are many issues that I didn't touch on. A key question, I mean, aging is driven, I would say, mostly by declining fertility. Fertility can decline with no change in the health of the population, but it's also driven by longer life, lower mortality at each age, and so on, and that goes with improved health. And then the big question is, are the additional years of life that people get as mortality declines, are they healthy and vital years? Are people able to, if they live longer, also to work longer and continue their contributions to society? Or are those additional years of disability and cognitive impairment and so on? And I think so far, mostly the answer has been positive, that the years, at least in the richer industrial countries, have been years of, mostly years of good health. But for cultural and policy reasons, people may be living longer in good health, but they're not working longer. They're mostly working shorter and living longer. So the relationship between health and aging is complicated, and I think it's just something we're going to have to adjust to over the years. I know there's so much cultural and individual and political resistance to raising retirement ages and so on. I'm not sure whether I've addressed the question you had in mind or not, but that's as I understood what you are asking. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ronald, can you please comment on your experience implementing NTA with other countries and partners such as UNFPA?
Yes. When we started NTA as an international comparative project, there were 7 countries, and then just gradually other countries, people in other countries heard about it and contacted us and were interested in joining this project, and it has grown in that way. Early on, well, we had very important support from IDRC, a Canadian foundation, and then very soon after that, we began to have important support from the United Nations. I think initially UNFPA, and that has continued. That has been and continues to be extremely important for the developing world, for the emerging economies. That support is largely limited to those developing economies, and work for the high-income countries has been funded in other ways by the U.S. National Institutes of Health, NIA, National Institute on Aging, but also by the European Union for work in Europe. and the Population Division of the United Nations, and also one or two other agencies besides UNFPA have also been helpful. Now there are, I think, around 80 countries that have teams that are members, and the accounts have been estimated now, I think, for 98 different countries. So they've been estimated for some countries that are not yet members. And I should say, we've heard from Latif. Latif has been absolutely key in expanding the coverage of NTA in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in Western and Central Africa. And he has organized a large network of countries and run training programs and gotten many established teams in many of these countries. He hosted the their global meeting of NTA in 2016 in Senegal, which was a wonderful meeting. Anyway, thank you for your question. I hope I've answered it.
Thank you. And now here's a question from Senegal for Dr. Latif. Latif, what percentage of the dependent population is actually employed?
Oui, merci.
Thank you.
Merci pour
Thank you
cette
for this
question.
question.
Donc, bon, au
For
Sénégal,
Senegal,
ce qu'on a à charge, donc nous, on mesure, il y a plusieurs
we
indicateurs, mais je vais donner les indicateurs
have measured
indicateurs
this
du NTA, donc, National
figure
Statistics
with
Office.
NTA,
Donc, nous
and
avons
we have
environ
approximately
39
39
qui
workers
prennent en charge 100
that are
donc, pratiquement.
considered
C'est ça.
practically.
Donc, c'est ce
This
que
is
nous
what
avons
we
dernièrement, en tout cas,
have
quand on
seen,
regarde les dernières données, certains documents
and this has been documented
on est en train d'aller autour de 40, 40.
over the years.
Pour 100 consommateurs, parce que ça, c'est une nouvelle
This is a
mesure
new
qui est
measure that was provided by NTA
dans la dépendance démographique classique.
beyond the classic
La
demographics.
formule n'est pas tout à fait la même. Il y a de légers changements. Ici, on prend en charge cette information que je vous donne, qui est
This is calculated through the network, the number of workers. We estimate that this is closer to reality. We must consider this before considering more. There are some who don't produce. This is what can be said regarding this question. We are working mainly on issues of aging. As you have seen, we are working primarily on the first dividend. This is the current problem. We are still on this stage of designing classrooms, universities, to really be able to take care of young people. There are important levels of fertility in West Africa still, which are some of the highest in the world. This has a significant influence or pressure. So leaders have an enormous pressure in our region here. Here, roads are wearing down quickly, so there's a lot of pressure to develop this. So this is what I can say about our current challenge in our region, to at least create economies that create employment, to have this first dividend. We must work on this principle that people work in our region. So creating work is very difficult, and our countries have not created enough work.
Over to you.
I pass things back to you. Thank you. In recognition of us nearing the end of this webinar, I'd like to ask one final question for both Ron and Latif. What would your recommendations be for future areas of focus in demographic dividend in the African continent? I'll start first with Ron.
I would start by saying Latif will know much more about this than I. I don't have good suggestions for how to involve the young more effectively in the labor force and productive labor. You know, the usual suggestion is education and so on, but I don't have any really good suggestions for how to make the labor markets work more effectively to employ the young. I don't know what the barriers to employment of the young are in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm eager to hear what Latif will say on this topic. And I should say there are other projects. For example, David Lamb at Michigan has been leading a project on the employment of the young in sub-Saharan Africa for a number of years, and I'm sure there are excellent ideas in that project. So I'm eager to hear from Latif on this point.
Okay, merci Ron.
Thank you, Ron, for the beginning of the answer. I am going to give concrete cases. We are working with the Economic Commission for Africa, which adopted NPAs, and we are trying to see on the budget level, the budget of our countries, to see what is allocated to different sectors, catalyzing sectors of the economy. We discovered that, for example, resources that are given to generate capital, for example, in health, over the past 10 years, are nearly 100% of our budget has gone towards this. Regarding human capital, this varies 11 to 20% of the budget in different countries. Since you're speaking about how we see the future, there is not adequate investment in education. This is a serious problem. I think all of the developed countries on the continent are starting to break this cycle. We can observe this and realize that today, with advancing technology, artificial intelligence, etc., there is not significant contribution here. Even if we have resources, we have not done much. This is not okay. This is clear. First, this is the first point. Secondly, we have seen what countries are putting in the infrastructure sector, energy, and public works. We see that we cannot produce or human capital. For human capital, we need infrastructure. So if this sector is not doing well, this will be difficult to begin a process of development. So this is what's clear. And what is invested in human capital is limited. What we're putting into energy is limited.
If we don't have energy, we cannot produce. And the employment that is created are of low productivity. So these jobs will not provide anything significant. Today, the Economic Commission for Africa, which is in charge of recommendations, has notes when technology is adopted or these cycles are broken so that a country can advance to a new cycle to create employment. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Carolina, and everyone.
Thank you so much, Professor Dramani. And again, thank you to you all for your participation today in this webinar. And we'd like to again thank our featured guests, Dr. Ronald D. Lee, as well as Dr. Latif Dramani. We will be making this webinar available online in the coming week, so please look out for that. And if you are not already subscribed, we encourage you to subscribe to the Demographic Dividend newsletter to receive news, events, and resources on the Demographic Dividend. Thank you all again, and happy World Population Day.